Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us again. Today, James and I are going to discuss foreign attitudes for Americans traveling over abroad, like the attitudes of the actual other countries towards Americans, and kind of James and my experiences from all the hard travels and living in these countries, and what we've kind of learned as far as how to acknowledge these situations, adapt, and kind of realize that whatever wrong images that other countries have of us, a lot of times we have the same or wrong images of the other countries as well, just because of what we've heard in the news or a compelling headline or just something we heard when we were growing up in school.
Yeah, I'll start with that, Randy. And I would say it is surprising, impressive, and depressing all at the same time how little information we need to form an opinion. It really can be as simple as a comment you heard at the dinner table or an interaction you had with one person or something you read in the newspaper. And I think this is just a human trait. We are quick to form opinions, and we can do so on very little information. And those opinions are sticky. Even if you get lots more information later, your initial impression, we talk about first impressions. So people make first impressions about countries and people from those countries all the time. And yeah, those impressions are reinforced. If you're in Russia right now, you've got a pretty dismal view of Ukraine and the war that's being fought there, because that's what you're hearing nonstop in the state media. And I don't know if that's the best example to use, but what I want to say is there's impressions that are formed by accident, by little random things, and impressions that are formed by a concentrated effort. But we should not fool ourselves. The beliefs we have about pretty much everything and everyone are the result of sometimes insignificant things. I saw this when I was mostly when I was working. I noticed it more because I would encounter people professionally, and then the discussion over lunch or in a negotiation would veer from the professional topic and into some ridiculous personal thing. Like, how come you Americans are so caught up with sexual issues? What's the big deal about Clinton getting a blowjob in the Oval Office? And how did that become a national scandal and get him impeached? If you're talking to a French person, like, what's the big deal? You expect him to have a couple of mistresses. And I would think, wow, this person has a very limited view about the US, and it's been formed based on a story or a headline. It took me many more years to realize that my own views were similarly skewed, but I was struck by that, and it was most often US politics that got people excited. Did you notice it when you were growing up or when you were working and living in other countries?
Yeah, I mean, I noticed it the same way you did. It's always the big headlines, and they're like, you Americans are so stupid because of this, or I can't believe this is such a big deal. And like, why do you have so many serial killers in the United States? And I'm like, I mean,
or mass shootings, or exactly.
Mass shootings. Yeah, exactly.
How come you guys are all racist?
That's right. And I think so if, twisting that around, when you look at other countries, when I go to other countries, I only know what I know before I get there. And so what I see is going on, I'm immediately making kind of conclusions like, oh, the French believe this, or whatever country I'm in Africa, this is the rule. And I don't understand like a history for this rule. Like, no one understands the history and the legislation behind owning a gun in the United States completely, except for Americans, and mostly Americans don't either. So when people in Europe or other countries spout their opinions about this, it's a lot deeper than just saying, hey, let's just take everyone's weapons away. Well, there's more weapons than people in the United States. That's not so easy to do. And they're worth a lot of money. And there's something called the Constitution and the Second Amendment. And so it's more complicated than just the president saying. The president doesn't even have the power to do that. So you have to, it's a lot more complicated than that. And no one seems to understand that. I've found very little people understand outside the United States that the states, in a lot of ways, are autonomous. They're like their own little countries. They have their own governments. They make their own laws in some cases. Now, the federal law is the standard for the most part, unless they don't want federal funding in some cases, but not always. But each state kind of makes their own, just like the law on pot. It's still against federal law, but we have states that allow it and they don't get federal funding for something because they're going against the federal law. And that's the way our system works. And no one said it's perfect. In some ways it's better, in some ways it's worse. I think the best example that I have of not being aware of how a country works and making criticisms about it, came from my military training down in Colombia. So when I first became a Green Beret, I volunteered to go to Lancero course. I think we may have talked about this before. The Lancero course in Colombia was a commando course that we helped set up to help them fight the war on drugs on our behalf. And we're helping to train their soldiers to be better soldiers. I already knew a lot about how we did tactics. And when we made the school, I'm sure we implemented a lot of this stuff in here, but they added stuff. For some reason, some of these things, I'm like, why the hell are we doing that? That sounds so tactically insane. Why would you do that and put yourself at risk? And eventually I came to the understanding that they have laws in their government. If we're in a war, because the United States military fights outside the United States. And when we're fighting outside the United States, we're fighting against enemies. And if the army's fighting, it's usually a established war that Congress has said we're at war. So we have rules of engagement, but if we're in combat and we're advancing, we have some rules where we're like, if we pass a body, we double tap it when we pass it by to make sure it's dead, so that guy won't get up behind us and mow everyone down. That's how we fight the war. Now, after the battle's over, then we take prisoners. If someone's alive, we won't double shoot them. But when we're in the middle of the battle, it obviously doesn't make sense to leave wounded people or people who are faking death behind us so that they can overwhelm us and win the battle. And so we have these rules that are very nuanced, Hey, we're in the battle, we're moving forward, we're taking the battle to the enemy. We got to get all the people to stop firing. Once they stop firing, then we can go back and take prisoners from the wounded and stuff like that. Now, when we try to implement that so I went to this course, I learned that they have these laws in place that they don't do that because their military is fighting within their country. Mm. And so they may have civilians on there as opposed to the FARC, and the FARC may look like the civilians and they're hard to tell apart, but they don't, and they always, because of the military, they're almost always the overwhelming force. So it's easy to die down the shooting. The FARC will shoot and run, and there's no reason to shoot everyone on the battlefield because the battle's over before it starts usually. And they realize this, and so their judicial system's like, hey, no, we're not authorizing that tactic. And so when I first got there, and I'm like, well, and they just thought I knew the tactic, or they taught it to me in Spanish and I wasn't listening, paying attention to that piece of it, because I've been trained my whole career that when you're assaulting, you double tap everyone to make sure they're dead. And when I was doing this, it was blanks, but I was doing it, I was reprimanded. And I'm like, what is going on? Why are you guys, what's your problem? And they're like, you can't do this. And so I had to learn their judicial system that was influenced how their tactics were done. And it made sense to me once I figured it out, once they explained it to me. Fast forward 4 years, I'm back in Colombia for Planned Colombia in 2019. It was the most money the United States had ever put in a country before 9/11 happened. And they're putting millions and millions of dollars. And one of it was to have Green Beret teams go down and train their military. I had my team. I was the only one who'd ever been in this school. We're getting down there and they're planning on teaching these tactics, our military tactics. And I stood up in front of everyone. I was like, hey, this isn't the way they do it. We got to change our tactics the way we're teaching it because, it'll break their laws. And one guy got up like, hey, they need to learn the right way to do things. And I was like, except they have laws against this. Teach the privates to do something against their law. They're going to get in trouble and go to jail for doing something they're not supposed to be doing. So that doesn't make sense. That's not why we're there. We're there to help them. We're not there to make them get more complicated with the politics. And it was a fight initially. And then I sat down with my supervisors. I'm like, hey, look, this is going to cause serious problems. And if you're trying to help them, we're not doing it if we don't teach them within their laws. Does that make sense or not? And they're like, yeah, you're right. So then I put a presentation together, and I was teaching large amounts of people in the Green Berets, like, hey, when you go to Columbia, this is the law and this is how you got to teach stuff. But it was just a little nuanced thing that we thought this is the way we thought things were done, because our military is one of the only military, I mean, a lot of Western European too, but most of the militaries in the world, they're involved within their country, and ours is always involved outside of our country, at least for the last 100 years or so.
So this brings up an important point about what we advise people to do in the Passionately Wrong podcast, Randy, which is challenge your assumptions. Challenge your assumptions. What you know absolutely is the right way to do it and works might or might not be. That's really hard to do because you don't know which assumptions to challenge. What I would say is, when you come into an organization, you're always coming into it with its existing history and background intact. If you don't know it, here's a warning sign, and I would say here's a reason for you to be very careful in your assumptions. If you come into a situation or an organization and it seems like they're doing something ridiculously stupid and wrong, you might want to stop before you raise your hand and say, oh, this is ridiculously stupid and wrong, and say, what am I missing here? It's possible I don't have all the facts. Can't tell you how many new people joined our organization, and in the space of 2 weeks, we're able to identify 500 things that were wrong about everything that we were doing. And you know what? They were right about a lot of them. But the piece that they didn't do was say, what am I missing? Why are they doing it this way? There's always a reason. It may be a good reason. It may be a bad reason, but there's a reason. And until you understand the context, why do they not do this thing that is so obvious to me? Why don't they do the double tap or the equivalent of that in the corporate world, which I can't come up with an analogy, but why don't they do it? And only then when you have the context, can you then potentially say, all right, well, does this still make sense? Could we modify it? Does it, is there a reason to change what we're doing? And having just that little bit of humility, and maybe even that's the trigger. When there's a thing that looks to be obviously wrong to you, ask yourself this question: is it really possible that I'm the only person who's noticed this? Or is it that the organization is aware of it and accepts it, and they're doing so for a reason? That goes a long way towards potentially helping you from being passionately wrong about what you assume you know and understand about another country. When you go to another place and you see everybody behaving a certain way and say, that's so dumb, I can't believe they do that. Well, you might just be missing some part of the context necessary. And that's the criticism or the complaint that we would have about when we're interacting with someone overseas. And they say, oh, you Americans are so dumb. You do X, Y, or Z. Just we gave a couple of examples at the beginning. The response to that is, yeah, you're missing some context. We may not be happy with that outcome, but there's a reason for why it works the way that it does. And the second piece of this is, is there anything to change, and does your solution make any sense? It can't be, as you were saying before, we'll just take away everyone's guns and you wouldn't have a problem. No, that's not really a very good solution for all sorts of reasons. So yeah, challenging your assumptions. And one of the ways that you might need to challenge your assumptions, if something seems glaringly obvious to you, maybe it's obvious because you're not seeing the whole picture.
One of the best examples comes from tourists, right? So when I used to live in Holland or Netherlands and in Britain, American tourists would come, and they'd come in, small groups, maybe 2 or 3 people, and they'd be on public transportation, and they'd be talking really loudly about all the things they saw or whatever. And everyone else is going to work or school, and they're reading the newspaper or reading a book or doing whatever they're doing, their daily life. And the tourists are all like excited about being there, and they're all loud and everything. And you spoke probably a little bit of Dutch as I did, and we did it. And of course I spoke English when I was in the UK, and you'd always hear the Dutch or the British. They'd always complain how loud the Americans were, how they're just really obnoxious, and just assume that all Americans were like that, not knowing that I was an American because I was quiet and watching it too. And funny enough, though, after about 5 years riding public transportation in the Netherlands, I started getting annoyed with the Americans too. I was like, geez, you're so loud. What is going on? But you know, in the same form, when you're in the United States and you have a group of foreigners and that are tourists, they also are very loud because they're tourists and they're not doing their daily activities and they're not going to work and school, and they're kind of on like the high of life for the moment while they want to talk about everything, and they're talking about everything right there in front of you because they're tourists and that's what they're doing. And so just kind of going back to what you said, you know, kind of putting everything in perspective and putting yourself in their shoes and trying to understand, you know, why they're that way. I mean, I'm sure there's some loud Americans no matter where they are. I've met some, but I'm sure every tourist isn't a loud American. They're just excited sometimes.
Yeah, you know, it's a good point. I hadn't thought about it to the same extent that it's just a function of tourism more than a function of Americanism. I'd probably have a deeply held prejudice just because I've observed it for so long. And also I observed
But
in the last,
but you observed it in a foreign country.
well, not only that, I've observed it here. That's what I was just going to say. For the last year and a bit since we've been back, you know, still have a little bit that quiet observer mode from being in foreign countries for so long, where you don't try to stand out immediately. You just observe what's going on. And so back here in the US, we observe a lot. How do people interact in restaurants and in public? And boy, they seem pretty loud here too.
but people are loud in restaurants, period. I mean, the Germans are always loud. I mean, if you're in a restaurant, you're in free time. I think most people, my observation when Americans were the loudest were there. It was in normal day-to-day activities when everyone else was like in there. I'm doing my daily thing. I'm just going to work, going to school, doing whatever. And the Americans are like, it's Monday morning, 10 o'clock. And they're like, blah, 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 you know, and yes, they are, because they're on vacation. And so I think that's I think my point is I've seen it. So I still stand by that. But I do, you know, when you're in restaurants, you're kind of letting your hair down too. When you're at a bar, same thing. The British and the Germans are very obnoxious in bars, just like Americans are, just like pretty much everyone is.
So I've been asking myself, is there a way to make assumptions less frequently? And I think it's tricky. If I travel to a country, you know, I'm going to Japan. I haven't been there in 20 years and I haven't thought much about it. I'm going to go there next month for a week. And could I do a week's worth of research in advance to try and understand culture and history and learn some phrases and really get ready to be a culturally sensitive tourist? I could, but I'm not gonna, because it's too much time and I don't want to invest that time. And so what does that mean? It means I'm going to go there with a completely wrong impression of what I think I understand about Japan, because I've seen a movie with a bullet train in it, and I read a newspaper headline about, you know, I mean, it's stupid, silly stuff. And I'm going to be wrong about a lot of things. And part of me knows that. And part of me says, I don't care, because of what we discussed in an earlier episode, which is that people are busy. They got 500 things competing for their attention. Does it hurt me in any way or in any consequential way to have grossly stereotyped and almost certainly wrong views about Japan and the Japanese before I go there? I'm not sure, right? So maybe the question back to you, Randy, is it so bad that we create quick and probably wrong impressions about people based on limited information, and we don't adjust those impressions? Is that such a big deal if you really are just going there for a week as a tourist?
I mean, as long as you're not insulting the whole country based on your observations, I think it's fine to make observations. And you don't, in a way, you don't really have to understand why they do it that way. You can just say, hey, you know, in the UK, they drive on the wrong side of the road. Kind of weird. You know, I've met Americans that think all of Europe drive on the wrong side of the road. and been passionately wrong about that. And I'm like, what are you talking about, man? But you know, well, I don't know. Go ahead.
No, you raise a good point, actually, which is if you don't go through the effort to correct potentially or get a bigger perspective, correct your misapprehensions, fine, you don't have to, but then you don't also need to go the further step of trying to tell the entire country why they're doing it wrong, right? So I like that distinction. You can be ignorant, but then keep it to yourself.
Yeah, and I mean, I think for the purposes of this episode, you know, how do you address when other people are making generalizations about the way Americans act? And, you know, most people don't care. Like, I mean, if I'm having a one-on-one conversation over a beer with the guy next to me, like, why are you driving on the wrong side of the street? And he's going to explain it to me, then I'll have some knowledge there. But in general, I mean, I'm not going to say this is stupid. I'm not going to go walk around town going, why are they driving on this side of the wrong side of the road? This is the dumbest thing I've ever seen in my life. I'm just going to rant down the road and have British people look at me like you're dumb. And I don't, yeah, like you said, there's no reason to raise that up. And I think the way you address like American generalizations is like, there's more to the story, man. And if you want to know about it, I'm glad to talk about it. But basically, we have different rules and different laws, and that's just the way it works.
Yeah, maybe trying to get them to analogize to a hot button issue in their own country and say, look, you guys are concerned about this, and there's no one sentence answer that explains that whole issue, is there? There's a really important views on both sides, and that's the reason you haven't solved it in 20 years of trying. So maybe just getting people to accept that it is nuanced or complicated.
And I think most people aren't happy with all the rules in their own country either. So I know a lot of people that are frustrated with, renting laws in France, for instance. And they're there for different reasons, because historically they've raised to a level where they're trying to protect the landlords and the tenants by mandating a 3-year lease, and which is impossible to get out of for the landlord. So if he doesn't get paid, they lose money, but the renter has to have his mother sign a permission form that if he doesn't pay the rent, his parents are going to pay the rent or something like that, which is one of the requirements. And I found out. So I was really offended that I had to get my mom to sign a note, and she didn't even qualify because she doesn't live in France. And then I had to pay a different service, a guarantor agency, and I had to pay an additional 10% of my rent to them every month for them to guarantee that they would pay my rent if I didn't pay the rent during my 3-year lease. And then they did just a deep dive. I want to, up my ass, fucking look at my finances. Sorry, I swore a lot there, but I was really offended by the whole thing, and it hurt. And then it took them a month to approve me, and they said, yeah, we'll take your 10%. And I was just like, but anyway, so I'm really offended by that. But there's a deep history of landlords taking advantage of tenants and tenants taking advantage of landlords. So they have this really complicated system that's not fun for anyone to go through, including French people.
Right. So if you can think of, and you don't even need to know the specific examples to be able to ask the question, hey, well, are there any things about the rules in your own country that you're not totally happy with? And, there's a history to that, right? And there's a reason why it developed the way that it did, or why it's hard to change. I guess the takeaways would be a little bit so far. Don't be too quick to assume that you understand why things are the way they are in another country. And as a result, don't be so quick to criticize. And it's maybe not necessarily constructive to try and change people's minds about something or to fix the problem.
But that doesn't mean you should be afraid to discuss it. And you may find that the people from that country agree with you. They're like, yeah, it's a messed up system, but it's our system.
Yeah. And, if you discuss a controversial topic, then if you come with a fixed mind, you're going to have just as appropriate and helpful a discussion as you would here talking with someone whose mind is also made up, right? So people whose minds are made up aren't really discussing an issue. They're just trying to proselytize for their issue or convince someone else that they're wrong. And that's not a discussion as far as I'm concerned. A discussion is, let's talk about it. I'll keep an open mind. But yeah, so a little bit of sensitivity to the broader perspective and to the fact that people's opinions do differ, especially on controversial topics. People's opinions differ. It goes a long way towards providing you with a way to deal with awkward conversations at home or abroad, I guess.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think the key is what you said, open-mindedness. You know, you need to be aware that every country specifically has their own history and has had their own issues and problems, and they dealt with it a specific way, and that evolved into, I mean, our rules are really complicated too. It's really hard for a lot of people to understand them. And just like similarly, a lot of these countries have a lot more history than we do anyway, and their rules developed in a different way.
So you're saying that the American way is not the only way or the right way, Randy? Only?
America, heck yeah. I would never say that.
No, I understand. Nor would I.
But yeah, maybe, I mean, but it might be the right way for our country just because the way everything's working now. And I'm not saying that we can't change stuff and make stuff better, but it would have to be encapsulated in the understanding of all our laws and how they came to be and what works for everybody over there, which is different than France, Germany, Spain, because of their history and the things they've gone through and the revolutions they've gone through and the people they've overthrown, and they had to make rules to check those. We have rules on our books that are old as hell that make no sense, that no one has taken off the books, and some people are like, why is this still there?
Yeah, and that probably is the key point for why such misunderstandings can arise, is because people, it's not just countries, right? People grow up in a culture that makes them think differently about issues. And it's hard to take yourself out of how you grew up. And maybe that's why it's possible for you and I to see this with a little bit of perspective. I'm not suggesting we can see things from outside the way we grew up, but because we grew up in several different countries, we say, oh, I see. There's different histories, there's different perspectives. And the reason for that is everything you just said, and people grow up differently as well.
I can't count how many times since I've been in Italy and now in Romania, how I've had conversations like exactly what we're talking about, where, and even with my girlfriend, like, what the hell are you guys thinking, you know, shooting down Roe versus Wade? And I was like, I mean, I just don't think it's a Supreme Court function. And they're like, the rule in the country should be this. I was like, that's fine, but that's not what the Supreme Court does. It decides if things are constitutional or not. If it doesn't have anything to do with the Constitution, probably shouldn't be involved with the Supreme Court. And it's in my opinion, and that's the way it was formed. And he's like, I don't understand. It's like, well, if you got a couple hours, I'll explain it to you. But I mean, that's just the way our system was put into place for a variety of reasons when the founding fathers made it. And now in my opinion, and not everyone shares this opinion, that's out with the states to make those decisions. And they're going to make the decisions based on who they want to vote for Congress and the Senate. And we'll see in the next 4 or 8 years how that's all going to pan out. Maybe we already saw it in the last one. I don't know. But that's just the way our system works. And it's all different. I don't understand all this stuff in Romania either. I don't understand why Andrew Tate got arrested. Just kidding. I kind of do.
So a little bit of humility and not being quick to judge, I think, is a useful attitude to bring with you and to have as a general rule.
Yeah.
All right.
I don't think it's anything to sling fists over.
No, I agree with you, Randy.
All right. Well, I hope this helped a little bit, kind of give you some, kind of open your eyes a little bit to how other countries can differ from ours, and just from James and my experiences over there, kind of give you some tools to adjust your own mind and maybe not be passionately wrong about something that's not as significant as you think.
Nice summary. All right. Talk to you guys next time. Thanks.
All right. Bye. We'd love to hear what you think, so please comment on the show with your thoughts. We read all of your comments.
Thanks for joining us, and thanks for subscribing. See you next time.